how a given food or foods impact your gut and the immune system therein. Remembering that the largest density of immune cells in your entire body is in your small intestine. So this is why we see such a connection between someone's gut health and how a food is digested and inflammation. Firstly, fermented foods, which are rich in probiotics, are a great idea to incorporate into your diet, but it's also where some of the dietary nuance comes in. There are a number of foods that for some people can be helpful, but for other people can be triggering. And this is why, for those of you listening or watching this, you may have had the experience of, I feel like I'm doing everything for my gut. I'm doing all the healthy food stuff, yet I'm still having symptoms. And this might be because you haven't quite yet put your finger on some of these foods that, again, for some people are helpful and for other people can be triggering. And I'll lead with this one analogy. I don't think anyone would argue that going for a jog is unhealthy. But if you had an active injury, let's say you had a low back injury, then an otherwise healthy activity, running, might flare you. And if you didn't realize you had said back injury, you'd be running and saying, I'm going for a run. I'm not even pushing myself too hard. I'm wearing the right shoes. I warmed up, all the things. Yet I'm still noticing that otherwise healthy activity, running, is flaring my back pain. The same thing can happen with your gut. And so let's walk through the foods to eat, the foods to avoid, and then some of those middle ground foods that, if you get these right, can really lead to a lot of healing and repair in the gut. So let's start with an obvious avoid, or at least reduce, which would be alcohol. There was one study that I think was really misquoted. It was a 2014 trial in which they injected directly into the small intestine alcohol. They did find increased leaky gut via a few different measures: lactose-mannitol ratio, or lactulose-mannitol ratio, tight junction protein upregulation. And to quote this paper, this study demonstrates that administration of a single moderate ethanol dose increased both small and large intestinal permeability in healthy volunteers. Now, the challenge here, hopefully fairly apparent, is that this was injecting alcohol directly into the small intestine. This is not a normal route of administration, or at least I hope it's not. What other data do we have regarding alcohol? Yes, you could argue wine has rich polyphenols and those antioxidants are health promoting. I think that's a little bit of a stretch, unless we're really going to be moderate with our consumption. And so this then begs the question, well, how much alcohol is acceptable? Again, I don't think anyone would argue alcohol is overtly health promoting, but if you're like many people, you may want to be able to go to a dinner and have a glass of wine or have a drink here or there. And if you're trying to optimize your health, having guidelines for how much alcohol might be reasonable is helpful. So a 2018 observational trial, fairly large, 600,000 individuals, wanted to answer this question. They also did something very important in that they adjusted for confounding variables. How old are you? What is your sex? Are you a smoker? Do you have diabetes? So after controlling for all those, what they found was that risk of mortality or death increased at 7 drinks per week. This tells us about risk of mortality, risk of death. It doesn't tell us necessarily about the risk of morbidity, symptoms. But I think we can assume it's clearly going to be somewhere less than 7 and probably more than 1. So what I would submit to you as sort of a practical interpretation of this is the better you're feeling, the healthier you are, the less symptoms, especially digestive symptoms that you have, the more alcohol you can get away with. And I think 2 to 3 drinks per week is probably reasonable. The more you're currently in the throes of not feeling well, that's where I'd be more judicious with alcohol. I never want to paint any of these things as extreme because this can foster undue stress. So if you do find yourself out and you are having a glass of wine and a healthcare educator has been very overzealous about the messaging, don't ever have any alcohol, what that could do is start this cascade of worry and fear, which in and of itself is detrimental to health and healing. So I don't think we have a very clear answer on alcohol. again, the worse you're feeling, the more I would abstain. And I would never, or I'd really try to avoid routinely going above 7 drinks per week, and perhaps 2 to 3 drinks per week is reasonable. And by the way, if this has been helpful, please comment and subscribe. This really does help us reach more people who are trying to improve their health. So it is quite deeply appreciated. The other food that's a fairly obvious don't consume, or at least generally avoid, would be UPFs, or ultra processed food. And these are foods that have been highly modified so as to increase the shelf life and the palatability. And I thought Kevin Whelan at King's College said it well, quoting, "Food additives are added to many UPFs, ultra-processed foods, and have themselves been shown to affect gut health. Evidence shows that some emulsifiers, sweeteners, colors, microparticles, and nanoparticles have effects on the gut microbiome, intestinal permeability, and intestinal inflammation. So because of this, we want to avoid ultra-processed or processed, moderate to highly processed meats and carbohydrates. So for meats, this would be anything salted, smoked, cured, dried, or canned. And in part, this is due to the nitrates, and the nitrosamines those lead to, which also occur in vegetables, by the way. Hot dogs, bacon, sausage, deli meats, these are things that I wouldn't make dietary staples. I wouldn't advise to have bacon or sausage every day. Could you? Yes. I think it would be better to make that a more of a once in a while sort of thing. Maybe bacon once per week, maybe twice. Maybe some sort of sausage once or twice per week. But these things can add up pretty quickly. If you're having a processed breakfast sausage every morning, and then at lunch you're having, let's say, deli turkey, this is just accruing more and more processed foods in your diet. And with the carbohydrates, they are fairly laden with emulsifiers, colors, and sweeteners. So think sweets, sugary drinks, sodas, fast foods, potato chips. Now, whole potatoes would be different than potato chips. So again, it's not to say you can never have any of these, but these are things that you want to be judicious with. And you can certainly have, let's say, pork, but consider pork loin that you cook at home, or a pork chop, things that haven't been processed so as to increase their shelf life. Another food to put on your radar would be non-organic foods. Let me lead by saying, I don't think everyone needs to be eating all organic all the time. I think that's too high of a bar for many people. There are no human studies directly assessing leaky gut and the impact of non-organic foods on leaky gut. However, there is a 2014 meta-analysis that did find that organic foods contain more polyphenols, which are antioxidants, that have been shown to reduce leaky gut. So think about it this way. We should favor conventional whole foods over organic processed foods, meaning conventionally raised chicken breast over organic chicken nuggets. And that's a simple framework I would apply, and do the best that you can. Let's discuss the best foods for inflammation. Foods that are rich in antioxidants. Some of the chief antioxidants, and this is not an exhaustive list, are glutathione, known as the master antioxidant, vitamin E, selenium, coenzyme Q10, and vitamin C. And one study I wanted to share with you, which I found fascinating, they looked at the effect of dark chocolate on the inflammatory response. Now, high cacao content, low sugar content, chocolate or cacao is actually fairly rich in antioxidant polyphenols. What this study did was take two groups of people. One group was given a polyphenol-free chocolate. The other group was given a polyphenol-containing chocolate. And then they induced stress and inflammation. And you're looking at two lines over time, over 160 minutes. Those who had the non-polyphenol chocolate saw, as you would expect, a spike in inflammation after these researchers induced inflammation in these subjects. However, those who consumed the dark chocolate containing the antioxidants, the polyphenols, they did not have inflammation after the induction. So this tells us that foods can have a powerful effect on buffering the inflammatory response, in this case, the stress-induced inflammatory response, which many of us are probably contending with. So that sort of sets the stage. Now let's talk about some of the foods that can help to replete your antioxidant stores. Because the world is constantly barraging us with insults that tear down and exhaust our antioxidant supply. So if we can consume foods that are rich in antioxidants, then we'll be replete. As far as glutathione, some of the top food sources are broccoli, asparagus, and avocado. For vitamin E, wheat germ oil and almonds are rich sources. Brazil nuts, eggs, and brown rice are all very rich in selenium. Vitamin C is contained in oranges, strawberries, potatoes, and peppers. And CoQ10 is rich in salmon and in organ meats. Now, that's not an exhaustive list, but it at least gives you some targets to make sure you're incorporating into your diet and across different keystone antioxidants so that you have a rich endogenous supply of antioxidants. So the second component complements eating in such a way so as to build up these stores of antioxidants. And this is eating to balance the cell membrane, which dictates how inflammatory your cells are. And this is where we have the entrance of omega-3 fatty acids. The ratio in the cell membrane of omega-3 to omega-6 is very important. You've likely heard of the importance of fish oil and omega-3s. And it's not to say that conversely, omega-6s are bad. However, in many Western societies, we consume too much omega-6, and it throws off this balance that we're trying to achieve in the cell membrane. And like many things in biology, balance is key. There's even a test for this, and I'm not necessarily endorsing this test or recommending you go out and do it, but just to make the point that the omega-3 index can be tested by a test like the Omega Quant. And scores that are more favorable or higher, having a higher ratio of omega-3, have been correlated with better cognition and a lower risk of heart disease. So the foods here to include would be salmon, mackerel, tuna, and sardines, aiming for 3 to 4 ounce servings per week of these. And additionally, flaxseed, chia seed, and walnuts are also good sources of omega-3s. Firstly, let me just cover a data point here from a group of researchers at Stanford published in the prestigious journal Cell, wherein they found a high fermented food diet was actually more anti-inflammatory than a high fiber diet. Now, it's not a contest, but it just makes the point. A 2023 umbrella meta-analysis, so a very comprehensive review of the body of data, found that probiotic supplementation led to reductions in numerous inflammatory cytokines, C-reactive protein, TNF-alpha, and interleukin-6. So there's pretty good data demonstrating that either fermented foods with the probiotics they contain or a probiotic supplement can reduce inflammation. Not surprising given the impact that probiotics have on the gut and the connection between the gut, the immune system, and inflammation. The goal here would be 1 to 6 servings of fermented foods per day. Some common fermented foods: kefir, yogurt, kombucha, sauerkraut, and kimchi. This is not an exhaustive list, and some traditional cultures have more nuanced, less sort of popularly known fermented foods, and these would all generally be fine. The nuance here has to do with someone's histamine tolerance. Now, histamine is a signaling molecule of the immune system. When someone has IBS, irritable bowel, SIBO, or other food reactivity and or gastrointestinal symptoms, they're more likely to have a high baseline level of histamine because of these things going on in the gut. We know that bacterial populations, when they overgrow, themselves, the bacteria produce histamine, but also as the immune system starts reacting and trying to counterbalance this overgrowth, as part of that inflammatory immune response, histamine is also released. So for some people, they may say, boy, I've tried fermented foods and I think I felt worse. Well, you're not alone. This is something that's decently well documented. And because of this, a few specific recommendations. Firstly, this is where a probiotic supplement might be better than foods, at least in the short term, until you heal. We've also compiled this table listing foods from lowest histamine content up through the highest. Kefir is the lowest histamine containing food. Conversely, kimchi is the highest. So in order from lowest to highest, kefir, more histamine in yogurt, more in sauerkraut, and the most in kimchi. Now, maybe not surprisingly, kimchi is also the richest in probiotics. So it's not to say kimchi is good or bad, but if you are someone who perhaps notices that when you consume fermented foods, you have a runny nose, you have flushing, you have heart palpitations, you have loose bowels, you have brain fog, you have insomnia, these are all symptoms demonstrative of histamine intolerance or histamine overload. And again, at least temporarily, reducing dietary histamine content can be helpful. And we do have a full low histamine diet guide for those of you who may want to try this, remembering that if you perform the correct dietary intervention for your gut, your body will let you know within 1 to 2 weeks that it's helpful. You'll start seeing symptoms reduce. And then I would ride that dietary protocol until you plateau, you're stable for 1 or 2 months, and then start reintroducing foods. Because remember also that as your gut heals, your food tolerance should increase. A low FODMAP diet has been shown to be quite beneficial for gastrointestinal symptoms and allows you a food list that is most likely to be tolerated. And so this is where avoiding high prebiotic or high FODMAP foods like broccoli, cauliflower, garlic, and onions, and instead focusing on lower FODMAP, lower prebiotic foods like kale, spinach, carrots, and cucumbers can be beneficial. And a low FODMAP diet guide is not hard to find. We have one easily available, and we'll link to that in the notes. And also the University of Monash has an app where you can punch in specific foods. And here the same concept applies, wherein if it's the right dietary approach for you, you'll notice a benefit within 1 or 2 weeks. And if so, continue on that dietary plan until you peak, maintain that approach for a month or 2, and then start reintroducing foods. And it has also been demonstrated for FODMAPs that with time, tolerance improves and people can successfully reintroduce these foods. So I just want to keep issuing this reminder that food tolerance should improve over time. And that brings us to polyphenols more squarely. Again, these are antioxidants in plant foods that give them color, but they also protect the plant. And this is part of the reason why you may have heard the axiom of eating the rainbow. Various colors will have, of plants that is, will have different polyphenol content. So this is why not just having greens, but having reds and oranges and purples in your diet is a good strategy. And coming back to some of the research here, a 2021 randomized control trial gave 50 subjects 3 servings per day of polyphenol-rich foods for 2 months. And to quote the authors of the paper, these data show for the first time that a polyphenol-rich diet can reduce serum zonulin levels, serum zonulin being a blood test for leaky gut. And I did want to touch on something that we had covered in a previous video on best foods for brain health, wherein we cite a study listing the most rich polyphenol foods. This includes cloves, peppermint, dark chocolate, flax seeds, rosemary, and blueberries. I want to clarify, this does not mean a Snickers bar, but if you're eating dark chocolate, which would have 85% or higher of cacao or cocoa, there won't be much sugar contained therein. You're looking at less than 5 grams of sugar per 1 serving of cacao or cocoa if it's dark, meaning 85% or higher. And this is usually disclosed very easily either on the front or the back of the label. Also, dark berries. It's the dark color that indicates or suggests a richness in the polyphenols. So blueberries, blackberries, and elderberries would all be viable considerations for this recommendation of dark chocolate and berries. Then we come to glutamine-rich foods, and these are foods that can help to repair the lining of the gut. Some of the richest sources of dietary glutamine are beef, chicken, and eggs, although it may be hard from diet alone to obtain sufficient glutamine to really heal the gut. So you may want to consider adding in 5 to 15 grams per day supplementally of glutamine. You've probably heard of the fact that bone broth is high in collagen, and collagen is one of the most abundant proteins in the human body, a building block for hair, skin, bones, ligament, and potentially for the lining of the gut. Now, this is another one where there's no direct human research looking at supplementing with or consuming bone broth and leaky gut. There is one in vitro study documenting that collagen will reduce leaky gut and inflammation. And there are other studies of varying levels of quality showing that collagen supplementation can reduce joint pain, bone health improvements, and improve skin wrinkles, leading me to recommend to drink 1 cup of bone broth on most days. Now you can make this at home, and we have written an article that gives you guidelines for home preparation of bone broth, or buy a store-bought bone broth. There is one important sort of caveat here. A 2019 study did find that supplementing with collagen would be more effective than consuming bone broth. So this doesn't invalidate, in my opinion, the utility of consuming bone broth on a regular basis, but it does suggest that for the best clinical effect, we may want to consider supplementing with a collagen supplement and taking 10 to 15 grams of hydrolyzed collagen peptides per day. That's the therapeutic dose. So to clarify, I feel this is one situation wherein it's both and. You can have a dietary foundation of consumption of bone broth, and especially if you're earlier in your healing journey and you want to make sure to replete and sort of repair tissues, I would consider adding a collagen supplement on top of regular consumption of bone broth. You may have heard people say, well, people who go gluten-free see reductions in zonulin, reductions of leaky gut. Well, it might be, as this study is substantiating, the reduction in FODMAP. Why this matters is because FODMAP tolerance is able to be recovered. 50% of the high FODMAP foods that are cut out of the diet can later be reintroduced, and tolerance can be recovered, because it could be that the FODMAPs are the problem. And again, we know that a temporary lower FODMAP diet heals leaky gut, reduces inflammation, and also reduces things like dysbiosis and small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, and therefore leads to improved tolerance. So if you did want to, let's say, go out and have that glass of wine and also maybe have a slice of pizza or a bowl of pasta or whatever it is, the odds are fairly likely that you will be able to do so. And why I care about this is because I would like for you to have the broadest diet and the most food freedom. and not be falsely attributing your improvements on a gluten-free diet to lifelong need to avoid gluten due to the gliadin, but rather it may have been the FODMAPs again, which is recoverable. So hopefully that all makes sense. And moving on to the next food here, dairy, controversial. Lactose malabsorption prevalence in the US is about 42%, and the cow's milk or the casein allergy is anywhere between 1 to 4%. Think about that for a moment. The lactose, the sugar, the carbohydrate, 42% intolerance. In actual protein allergy, 1 to 5%. Now, remember that the other carbohydrates, the FODMAPs, tolerance there is recoverable. Well, same thing here. Meta-analyses have demonstrated that interventions that help heal the gut, namely probiotics, improve lactose tolerance. Now, why is this? Well, when the food reactivity is carbohydrate malabsorption, again, that is recoverable because as the intestinal tract heals, endogenous or your internal production of enzymes also tends to be improved. And that allows absorption and digestion of the carbohydrates that weren't able to be digested prior. Again, why all this matters is if you've had an experience of improvement when cutting out gluten or dairy, it's more likely that it's the carbohydrate malabsorption component that when you reduce those carbohydrates, you saw improvements that led to your improvements. And that is able to be improved. And it's much more rare, although it can happen, but it's more rare that you have a true inflammatory reaction to one of the antigenic proteins in these foods. So zooming way out, the take home here is if you've gone gluten-free or you've gone dairy-free, don't be afraid to reintroduce these foods, because if the issue was carbohydrate malabsorption, that tends to improve over time, and therefore tolerance also tends to improve over time. And if you do perform a reintroduction and you do notice an aversion, then as we always say, listen to your body. But if you haven't run an experiment, it's something to bear in mind. Okay, so then a few foods that are controversial. Artificial sweeteners. If you had asked me on this 5+ years ago, I would have had a more conservative perspective on artificial sweeteners, sort of against them. Looking at this 2023 review paper, I'll quote, although some human trials have observed a dysbiotic effect of artificial sweeteners, many randomized control trials have reported a lack of significant effects on the gut microbiota. Now, the gut microbiota is not leaky gut, but they are interrelated. I'm not convinced in a big credit to Lane Norton, who I think has done some great reporting on artificial sweeteners as it pertains to metabolic health. But I'm not convinced that artificial sweeteners are going to be a problem for everyone. I had cited years ago the San Antonio longitudinal study on aging, and they did find a correlation between higher consumption of artificially sweetened drinks and waist circumference. But evidently, as more research has been done, they're not finding any metabolic ill effects, and we weren't able to find anything convincing showing exacerbations of gastrointestinal symptoms. And so ultimately, I would listen to your body, but I don't think from a data-driven perspective, we can say that artificial sweeteners are going to be a problem for most people and sort of fuel leaky gut. Nightshade vegetables. This is also something where there's not a lot of research, but this is something that I personally have noticed. If I consume too much either tomato or red peppers, I will experience joint pain, as will my mother. So this tends, at least in my observation, to follow family lines. So that's something to think about. If you've done everything else and you're noticing joint pain, take stock of the nightshades that you're consuming and see if you can draw a correlation, which should be repeatable, between consumption of nightshades and joint pain. Usually it starts about 24 hours later. Again, this is not going to be a majority thing, but it's a fine-tuning factor to pay attention to. Seed oils. One study did not find that soybean oil increased lipopolysaccharides. And I think you could make a case that continual heating and reheating of seed oils might pose a problem. But I'm not convinced that seed oils pose a problem for human health. I know this is a loaded topic, and we are reviewing the evidence here, and I plan on releasing a piece that really goes through this in a very thoughtful and evidence-based fashion. And certainly my persuasion is more leaning in the direction away from seed oils because they're not necessarily an ancestral norm, if you will. But when juxtaposing that across randomized control trials that are designed to clarify, is the seed oil the problem, or is it more of a bystander effect or guilt by association? At least thus far, I'm not convinced that seed oils pose a problem. I know that sounds like heresy, but more to follow. And then finally, there's a few plant irritants, oxalates, salicylates, and lectins. And I can't say that, well, firstly, there's not ample research to give us the luxury of having scientific evidence to learn from. So then it's more so anecdote and experience. And I can't say that any of these foods seem to be problematic for most people. Perhaps if someone is consuming a very high amount of oxalates, salicylates, or lectins, reducing that could be helpful. I think what happens more often than not, especially in the case of lectins, people make many changes that improve the quality of their diet, and they think it's because of the lectins, but sort of like the gluten-free example, people go gluten-free, but they actually end up going low FODMAP, and it might be the FODMAP reduction that was actually why they improved. I suspect with lectins, that's what's happening. And at some point, we'll do a full review on lectins also. And then oxalates and salicylates, my perspective here, and I don't think anyone has this fully figured out, but my thinking is that if someone is not consuming a very, very high amount of either one of these, then it's more likely you need to improve the health of their gut by going through all the other steps that we outlined. And the oxalate or salicylate sensitivities are usually secondary to a gut that's not very healthy. And I wanted to close with a quote from Confucius. For those of you who may be looking into an anti-inflammatory diet, you may be struggling with joint pain or fatigue or bloating or brain fog or whatever it is. And I know that can be frustrating. So here is what Confucius had to say on the matter. It does not matter how slowly you go as long as you do not stop. So if you hit a roadblock, if you've been frustrated, keep at it, don't stop. And even if your progress is slow, keep going. Okay, this is Dr. Ruscio. Hope this helps, and I'll talk to you next time.